Hold that tray. You're blocking the donors. That was the first sentence anyone said to me after I walked through the side entrance of the Dock Street Theater. I hadn't even taken off my carry-on bag. A catering manager I'd never met shoved a silver tray loaded with champagne flutes toward me because my mother had already told everyone I would help wherever needed. I caught the tray before it slipped. Years of balancing equipment that weighed more than most people expected from a woman made it almost automatic. Then I heard my mother's heels. Roxanne. She didn't say my name, she snapped it. Before I could answer, her fingers locked around my upper arm and dragged me through a narrow corridor beside the kitchen. The smell of expensive perfume disappeared behind the scent of roasted beef, butter, and industrial dish soap. She released my arm only long enough to point at me. What were you thinking? I came as soon as I landed. I didn't ask when you landed. Her eyes swept over my plain navy dress. It wasn't designer. It wasn't new. It fit well enough, and after a transport flight that lasted nearly 30 hours with military routing, it was the nicest thing I had packed. You look exhausted. I am. You couldn't fix your hair? I tried. She laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because disappointment had become her favorite language. Do you have any idea what tonight costs? I glanced toward the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, fresh orchids flown in from Florida, a string quartet warming up behind the stage. I noticed details the way I'd been trained to notice exits, blind spots, and movement patterns. The floral contract alone was over $40,000, she continued. Every important family in Charleston is here. I know. No, you don't. She stepped closer until I could smell the champagne on her breath. You disgrace the family's elite aesthetic. The words landed harder than the grip she'd had on my arm. She looked over my shoulder, as if checking whether anyone might overhear. You're pale. I haven't slept much. You look like someone who wandered in from a government office basement. I almost smiled. If she had known where I'd actually spent the previous week, she'd never have compared it to a basement. Instead, I simply nodded. What do you need me to do? Her expression softened for exactly half a second. Not with kindness, with satisfaction. I need you useful. She pointed toward a stack of silver serving trays. Carry, champagne. I thought I was invited. You are, just not where people can see you. The kitchen staff avoided eye contact. One young server quietly whispered, I'm sorry. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. None of this was his fault. I slid both hands beneath the tray. 36 glasses, almost 50 pounds with the silver, comfortable. As I turned toward the ballroom, something inside my purse shifted. A small brass compass. My father's compass. The only thing I'd refused to leave behind. Earlier that afternoon, while waiting during a security transfer, I'd opened it without really thinking. Inside the lid, scratched so lightly most people missed it, were 5 words. Stand steady until truth arrives. Nobody else knew those words were there. Nobody in that ballroom knew why my father had given it to me. And before this night ended, someone was going to recognize that compass before they recognized me. I didn't know how. I only knew it would change everything. So I closed my purse and walked into the ballroom. Conversations floated between tables. People discussed investment portfolios, historic preservation, country club elections, wine auctions. One man complained that his Gulfstream maintenance bill had climbed to $18,406.72 centavos. Another joked that his third vacation home had become a tax burden. The room laughed. I kept walking. A woman accepted a champagne flute without looking at my face. Another handed me an empty glass like I belonged to the catering company. That part didn't bother me. People judge uniforms. Tonight, my uniform happened to be invisible. Near the stage, I spotted Cynthia. My younger sister looked exactly the way my mother wanted every photograph to look. Perfect makeup, perfect smile. Perfect diamond ring large enough to catch the chandelier light every few seconds. She waved at someone across the room without noticing me, or pretending not to. Either one was believable. I reached the VIP section just as my mother intercepted me again. She adjusted the angle of the tray with unnecessary force. Stand straighter. I am. No, you're slouching. I rolled my shoulders back, not because she'd ordered me to. Because scar tissue tightened whenever I carried uneven weight. The movement lasted maybe 2 seconds. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. You are a disgrace to us, Roxanne. Every word came through clenched teeth. Stand in the shadows. She glanced toward several donors watching from nearby tables. We don't need some low-level government clerk ruining our family's big night. Silence sat between us. There are moments when people expect you to defend yourself. Explain. Argue. Beg. I'd spent enough years in secure operations to understand something simpler. Not every attack deserves ammunition. I inhaled for 4 counts, held it for 4, exhaled for 4, held again for 4. Box breathing. Simple, quiet, reliable. By the second cycle, my pulse had already slowed. My mother mistook calm for surrender. She smiled. There, that's better. She walked away believing she'd won. I picked up the tray again. My back stayed perfectly straight. Not because she demanded it. Because no one, not even family, gets to decide whether I stand with dignity. They only get to reveal whether they recognize it. And tonight, no one in that glittering ballroom had the slightest idea who they had just ordered into the shadows. This opening also plants the required early open loop around my father's brass compass and the hidden truth that will only be fully understood by the end of the story, in line with your requested structure. I shifted the weight of the silver tray to my left hand and stepped around a waiter carrying miniature crab cakes, keeping my pace smooth enough that not a single champagne flute rattled. The ballroom looked effortless. It never is. Every polished event hides someone lifting, carrying, fixing, cleaning, or paying. In my family's case, I had been doing all 4. A gray-haired banker accepted a glass from my tray without looking at me. Thank you. He wasn't rude. He simply assumed I belonged to the catering crew. I preferred that over being recognized as Victoria Danforth's disappointing older daughter. At least strangers judged me by 1 moment instead of 20 years. Across the room, a jazz trio eased into another song while guests drifted toward the dessert tables. I caught pieces of conversations. Our Naples condo closed at $3.8 million. We're taking the yacht to Bermuda after Labor Day. Cynthia's boutique has become the place for custom interiors. That last sentence almost made me laugh. Almost. Cynthia's boutique. People loved talking about how she'd built it from nothing. She loved that version even more. The truth lived inside monthly bank transfers nobody ever questioned. 8 years earlier, after my father died, our attorney established the Danforth Family Trust. Everyone assumed my father had left behind enough investments to protect the estate. He hadn't. His medical bills had eaten through most of his retirement. The Charleston house looked expensive because it had been in our family for generations, not because we had cash. The trust should have run dry within 18 months. Instead, it never missed a payment, every month. Like clockwork, the property, taxes, insurance, maintenance, the landscaping contract, the wine cellar repairs after a broken humidity system, even Cynthia's boutique lease on King Street. Everything arrived through the trust. Nobody ever asked where the money came from. That was exactly how I designed it. An anonymous legal entity managed by a defense's attorney in Northern Virginia quietly deposited funds into the trust account. Public records showed nothing unusual. No connection to me, no military affiliation, no classified compensation. Exactly the way federal security guidelines required. My family thought my government paycheck barely covered rent. If only they knew. Combat hazard pay, deployment bonuses, retention incentives, special mission compensation, money attached to assignments I couldn't even acknowledge existed. Over 8 years, more than $240,000 had flowed into that trust. Not because I wanted praise, because my father had asked me, during our last conversation, to keep the family home standing if I ever had the chance. He never asked me to carry everyone else forever. That part had become my own mistake. I stopped beside table 7. A woman wearing emerald earrings frowned into her champagne. This isn't cold enough. I'm sorry. I exchanged it for another glass. She smiled at the fresh one as though the first had personally insulted her. Funny how people measure emergencies. My phone remained locked inside my purse. No notifications, no secure messages. For the first time in weeks, nobody needed me to solve a crisis, yet I somehow found myself worrying about champagne temperatures. Life has a strange sense of humor. As I approached the dessert display, someone blocked my path, Cynthia. She looked flawless from every angle she believed people were watching. Finally, she reached onto my tray without asking. I've been looking everywhere for decent champagne. I've been walking the room, I noticed. She sipped once before making a face. I swear they should have ordered the French Reserve. They did. Then why does this taste average? I shrugged. Maybe because it's free. She rolled her eyes. You've always had that military sarcasm. I didn't answer. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. You need to pay attention tonight. I am. No. I mean, really pay attention. Her eyes drifted toward Julian across the ballroom. He stood beside several investors, laughing louder than anyone else. His tuxedo probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. His confidence was rented, just like everything else in his life. My future in-laws are here, Cynthia whispered. Keep their glasses full. I think the catering staff has that covered. I wasn't asking. She smiled sweetly enough that anyone watching would think we were sharing sisterly affection. Then came the sentence she'd probably rehearsed. At least the military taught you how to serve people of actual value. For 1 second, the ballroom became very quiet inside my head. Not because of what she said, because of everything she didn't know. She had never seen the evacuation reports, never listened to terrified voices over encrypted radios, never watched names disappear from casualty lists because a rescue arrived 43 seconds sooner than expected. Actual value. Interesting choice of words. I looked at the champagne in her hand. That single glass cost about $23. She took another sip. Hazard Pay bought it. The boutique she'd bragged about during magazine interviews? Hazard Pay. The imported marble countertops in her showroom? Hazard Pay. The luxury SUV parked outside with personalized plates? Hazard Pay. The designer engagement party happening around us? Hazard Pay. She had spent years enjoying money earned by people who accepted risks she couldn't imagine. Not stolen money, earned money. Paid in exchange for missing birthdays, broken sleep, classified funerals, and scars hidden beneath sleeves. Some of those scars rested quietly beneath the fabric covering my shoulders. She had never asked where they came from. She had decided they weren't worth asking about. Julian finally wandered over with 2 investors. Babe, he said, wrapping an arm around Cynthia. Everything perfect? She kissed his cheek. Of course. He looked at me. Oh, Roxanne. That pause before my name told me he had forgotten it. You don't have to stand there all night. I'm fine. He picked up another champagne flute. Good. We need everyone helping tonight. Everyone. An interesting word from a man whose family's real estate company was rumored to owe creditors millions. Rumors travel quickly through Charleston. Facts travel slower. I watched him toast with men he desperately needed to impress. Nobody noticed that the server holding the tray owned half the family estate they were admiring. Nobody noticed that the trust financing this evening existed only because I kept authorizing deposits year after year. Nobody noticed because I had made sure they couldn't. Silence protects more than secrets. Sometimes it protects people who haven't earned it. Cynthia patted my arm as if rewarding good behavior. See? You're useful when you stop arguing. I almost corrected her. I hadn't stopped arguing. I'd simply stopped believing every battle deserved to happen out loud. I lifted the tray again and stepped around them without another word. Behind me, laughter returned. Crystal glasses clinked. The quartet started another song. Ahead of me, another group of guests reached for champagne they assumed had appeared by magic. None of them could see the invisible ledger balancing every elegant moment in that ballroom. But ledgers have one habit that never changes. Sooner or later, every account comes due. I watched another guest reach for a champagne flute, and the smooth motion of my hand brought back a completely different room. No chandeliers. No string quartet. No polished marble. Just reinforced concrete, filtered air, and steel doors that stayed locked until 3 separate security systems agreed you belonged inside. Fort Meade doesn't impress people because of what they can see. It impresses them because of everything they never will. The Joint Operations Center sat behind layers of security that erased the outside world 1 checkpoint at a time. By the time I stepped into the classified operations vault, my phone, smartwatch, wedding ring, and every personal item had already been locked away. Inside, nobody called me Roxanne, nobody cared who my family was, nobody asked where I spent Christmas. I was simply Hades. Hades' ISR feed is drifting. I'm on it. I slid into my station, fingers already moving across 2 encrypted keyboards. 48 displays stretched across the front wall, satellite imagery, thermal overlays, drone telemetry, signals intelligence, blue force trackers, weather data. Every screen showed another piece of the same impossible puzzle. The room stayed surprisingly quiet. Nobody yelled. Hollywood gets that wrong. People who make life or death decisions usually lower their voices instead of raising them. A Navy captain stood behind us. Status, I answered without turning around. Strike Package Bravo is holding at Checkpoint 3. Enemy movement? Confirmed. 4 technical vehicles moving southeast at 41 miles per hour. A young intelligence analyst pointed toward another monitor. They're changing frequencies. I see it. I opened another encrypted window. They're hopping every 11 seconds. Can we keep up? We don't have to. My fingers paused over the keyboard. We make them stop. 3 commands later, an electronic warfare aircraft received new instructions. 34 seconds after that, the hostile radios went silent. The analyst blinked. You jammed the entire band. No, I zoomed in on the spectrum display. I left one channel untouched. Why? Because everyone needs somewhere to run. He frowned. I pointed at the map. If they think one frequency is still safe, they'll all migrate there. Understanding spread across his face. And we'll hear everything. Exactly. Sometimes winning isn't about making noise. It's about convincing the other side to make it for you. An Air Force major hurried toward my console. Hades. I looked up. Talk, drone 2 lost visual. How long? 8 seconds. I checked the satellite angle. Cloud cover? No. I enlarged another window, then another. Finally, I found it. They're under the overpass. The major stared at the screen. I don't even see them. You weren't looking at the shadows. He grinned. I keep forgetting you notice everything. Not everything. Just the things that mattered. The room suddenly shifted gears. A secure phone rang. Someone answered. Nobody liked the expression on his face. He covered the receiver. Ground team just made contact. The room became still. The giant display switched to live tactical mapping. 12 friendly operators, 1 medic, 1 explosive specialist, 3 armored vehicles disabled. Enemy positions multiplying, distance to extraction point 0.8 miles. A colonel stepped beside my chair. Hades, yes sir. Talk me through it. I took one slow breath, no panic, no hesitation. The western route is gone. I agree. The eastern route becomes a kill zone in 6 minutes. He nodded. Options? Zoomed farther into the terrain, abandoned irrigation channels, collapsed buildings, power lines, a dried riverbed. Then I saw it. There. The colonel leaned closer. The maintenance tunnel? It exits behind their observation line. Our satellite resolution isn't good enough. It doesn't have to be. I highlighted several heat signatures. The concrete stayed cooler than the surrounding ground all morning. You can tell it's hollow? I can. Silence. Then the colonel smiled. I'll never understand how your brain works. It doesn't matter. I transmitted new coordinates. It only has to work once. Orders spread through the operations floor. Pilots adjusted. Analysts recalculated. Nobody celebrated. Success hadn't happened yet. Inside the vault, every second had a job. Outside the vault, time kept moving too. My personal phone sat inside locker 214, completely disconnected from me. I couldn't hear it. I couldn't see it. But later, I learned exactly what it had been doing while we fought to keep 12 Americans alive. 10:47 a.m. Victoria, why are this month's trust transfers delayed? 10:49 a.m. Victoria, Cynthia is meeting vendors today. 10:53 a.m. Victoria, you are ruining your sister's engagement week. 10:58 a.m. Victoria, stop pretending you're too busy to answer your own mother. 11:04 a.m. Victoria, if you've interfered with the trust again, don't bother coming home. At 11:06 a.m., another message arrived. Victoria, government clerks don't get to play financial games with this family. At that exact moment, I was authorizing electronic interference that protected operators taking live fire half a world away. One conversation happened through encrypted military networks. The other happened through angry text messages I wouldn't even read until long after midnight. The contrast would have been funny if it weren't so familiar. Hades, the colonel's voice pulled me back. Ground team entering the tunnel. I watched 12 blue icons disappear beneath the digital map. No communication, no GPS. Concrete blocked almost everything. For 39 seconds, we knew nothing. Those 39 seconds felt longer than some deployments. An analyst whispered, "Come on." Nobody else spoke. Then one by one, blue icons reappeared on the opposite side. Exactly where they needed to be. The room exhaled together. The colonel rested a hand on the back of my chair. Nice work. I nodded once, no speeches, no applause. Another crisis would arrive soon enough. They always did. By the time my shift ended nearly 14 hours later, the operations floor had already moved on to another theater, another briefing, another set of names the public would never hear. I collected my phone from the secure locker. 23 missed messages, 6 voicemails, every one of them from my family. Not one asked if I was safe. Not one wondered where I'd been. Not one imagined that while they worried about boutique invoices and engagement flowers, I had spent the day holding the lives of strangers steady, with nothing more than judgment, discipline, and a keyboard. I slipped the phone into my bag without answering. Some responsibilities come with medals no one is allowed to discuss. Others come with people who never notice the weight you're already carrying. I knew which one deserved my strength. I slipped another champagne flute onto a guest's table, and the sharp clink of crystal against polished wood carried me back to another sound. Mortars. The kind that don't echo until it's already too late. The operations clock above my workstation read 021341 Zulu. Nobody in the Joint Operations Center had spoken above a normal voice all night. That changed when every communications panel on the wall flashed red at once. Signal loss. Primary network is down. Team Viper just disappeared. The room didn't explode into panic. It compressed into focus. A satellite technician looked at me. Hades, I'm here. We lost every encrypted channel. Cause? Intentional jamming. I pulled 3 windows across my screen. Spectrums analysis, drone telemetry, orbital satellite coverage. Someone had built a sophisticated electronic wall around a compound deep inside the Middle East. Inside that wall were 12 operators. One of them was Master Chief Petty Officer Weston Cross. At the time, I knew him only by his call sign. The intelligence officer spoke carefully. They're pinned against the northern compound wall. Another voice followed. Mortars are walking closer. A third analyst didn't even try to hide the urgency. If we don't reconnect within a minute, extraction is impossible. I enlarged the live drone feed. Smoke, collapsed concrete, heat signatures. The enemy had chosen their position well. Every approved communications route had already failed. The colonel stepped beside me. Options, I answered honestly. Nothing authorized. He didn't look away from the screens. What isn't authorized? I understood exactly what he meant. Every classified system comes with guardrails. Not because engineers enjoy rules, because those rules protect the entire network. There was one way around the communications blackout. It also happened to violate enough security protocols to end a career, maybe several. I opened a menu that almost nobody ever touched. A bright warning appeared. Unavastur's satellite firewall modification. The colonel read it. So that's real. It is. Probability 42%. Failure? We lose the secure satellite link. For how long? I don't know. The room became very quiet. One analyst whispered, "That's our entire regional network." He wasn't wrong. If my bypass failed, it could compromise operations well beyond that compound. If I did nothing, 12 Americans were unlikely to survive. Sometimes leadership doesn't offer good choices, only expensive ones. I rested both hands on the keyboard. "Colonel," he looked at me, "if this goes wrong, I'll accept full responsibility." His answer came without hesitation. "I know you will." That wasn't permission. He couldn't legally give it. It was trust. There is a difference. I started typing. Encryption keys, manual routing tables, satellite relay priorities. Everything happened faster than memory usually allows. Somewhere inside of the compound, Weston Cross and his team were still trapped. Inside the operations center, every person stopped talking. Nobody wanted to distract me. The warning window flashed again. Final confirmation. Nothing happened. 1 second. 2. 5. Then every screen flickered. Several analysts inhaled at the same time. A technician yelled, "We're back online." Another shouted, "Partial bandwidth only. Good enough." I immediately transmitted emergency coordinates to the rescue helicopter circling outside the jamming radius. The pilot answered through a secure channel. Coordinates received. Confirm approach. 2 minutes. I shook my head. You don't have 2. The drone camera updated. Mortars landed closer. Chunks of concrete burst across the screen. One blue tracking icon stopped moving. My heartbeat stayed steady. Emotion could wait. Math couldn't. I recalculated the helicopter's flight path. Straight line. Ignore the original safety corridor. The pilot understood before I finished. That's inside hostile airspace. It is. I'll be exposed. For 47 seconds. Silence. Then he laughed once. Guess I'd better fly fast. He pushed the aircraft harder than mission planners ever intended. Every monitor tracked the helicopter racing across the map. 47 seconds. That was the difference. 47 seconds inside enemy engagement range. 47 seconds that military planners normally rejected without discussion. 47 seconds that became the only window 12 operators had left. The helicopter reached the compound. Blue icons began moving. 1, 3, 7, all 12. Someone behind me finally said it. They're coming home. Nobody cheered. Not yet. Not until the helicopter crossed back outside hostile territory. The pilot's voice returned. Package secure. Only then did the room breathe again. I leaned back for the first time in hours. The colonel folded his arms. You realize what you just did. I do. You bypassed classified satellite protections. Yes, sir. You'll probably face a review board. I know. He studied me for several seconds. I'd make the same decision. 3 days later, I sat alone inside a closed-door military tribunal. No reporters, no audience, no public record. 3 senior officers questioned every keystroke I'd entered, every authorization I'd ignored, every safeguard I'd bypassed. One admiral finally asked the question that mattered. Lieutenant Commander Danforth, if presented with the same circumstances tomorrow, would you violate protocol again? I answered before he finished writing. If 12 operators were facing the same situation, yes. Sir, he watched me. You understand your career depends on this answer. My career exists to support theirs. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The hearing ended that afternoon. The official outcome remained classified. I wasn't dismissed. I wasn't promoted. I simply went back to work, because operations don't stop while paperwork catches up. That same weekend, I flew home for my father's funeral. I arrived carrying one black garment bag and the brass compass he'd left me years earlier. The front porch lights were on. Cars lined both sides of the street. Family friends filled the house. I walked to the front door and turned the handle. Locked, I knocked. A minute later, my mother opened the door just wide enough to stand in the gap. Oh, she looked surprised. I thought you'd arrive later. My flight landed early, she hesitated. There's a small problem. What kind of problem? We needed your bedroom. I stared at her. For what? Cynthia's wedding dress. I waited for the rest. There wasn't any. The preservation company delivered everything yesterday. Her gowns, accessories, display racks. There wasn't enough storage. I looked past her shoulder. The hallway I had grown up walking through suddenly felt unfamiliar. So where am I sleeping? She folded her arms. We booked you a room at the Harbor Lantern Inn. You gave away my room before Dad's funeral? It wasn't personal. No, it never was. That was always the explanation. Not personal, just practical. I stood on the porch holding my garment bag while guests inside laughed over old family stories. Nobody noticed I hadn't come in. My father had spent a lifetime building a home. I had spent years protecting people I'd never meet again. And somehow, after helping bring 12 sons back to their families, I wasn't welcome inside my own house. So I picked up my bag, slipped the brass compass into my coat pocket, and walked back toward the rental car without knocking a second time. Some doors don't close because they're locked. They close because the people behind them have already decided you don't belong. I set the nearly empty tray onto a catering cart, flexed my fingers once, and reached for a fresh row of champagne before a voice stopped me. Mother wants a word. Julian. He stood beside the service entrance with the polished smile of a man who believed expensive cufflinks could distract people from bad decisions. I'll find her after I finish this. No, he said. Now. He wasn't asking. I picked up one last flute, handed it to a passing guest, and followed him through a pair of French doors into the conservatory. The music from the ballroom faded behind thick glass. The room smelled faintly of orchids and citrus trees. Moonlight reflected off the glass ceiling, while antique stone planters lined the walls. It was one of my father's favorite rooms. He used to drink coffee there every Sunday morning, claiming it was the only place in the house quiet enough to hear himself think. Now the silence felt staged. Victoria was already seated at a circular glass table. 3 folders rested neatly in front of her. She didn't offer me a chair. I've been waiting. I was working. You were carrying trays. I believe that's what you assigned me to do. Julian chuckled as though we'd exchanged a clever joke. Victoria didn't. She pushed the thickest folder across the table. Read it. I looked at the title, Irrevocable Transfer of Real Property Interest. The attorney's office was local. The notarization had already been prepared. Someone expected my signature tonight. I turned one page, then another. The document transferred my entire 50% ownership of my father's historic Charleston property to Cynthia. Immediately, permanently, without compensation. I closed the folder. No. Victoria folded her hands. You haven't finished reading. I've read enough. Julian leaned forward. Let's be adults. I already am. He ignored the answer. Cynthia has a future here. So do I. Not really, he smiled politely. You've chosen another life, another life. An interesting way to describe years of service he couldn't even imagine. Victoria finally spoke. The estate needs unified ownership. It already has 2 legal owners, which complicates everything. For whom? Neither of them answered. They exchanged one quick glance. Tiny, almost invisible. Enough. I had spent too many years reading body language under pressure to miss it. This wasn't about simplifying paperwork. It was about urgency, financial urgency. I reopened the folder and skimmed more carefully. There it was, buried halfway through the supporting documents. A preliminary appraisal, a pending refinancing request, projected liquidation value. I looked up. You're planning to sell the property. Julian answered too quickly. We're considering options. No. I tapped the appraisal. You're preparing to sell it. Victoria's jaw tightened. The market is favorable. The market isn't your problem. Silence. There it is, I said quietly. The real conversation. Julian's smile disappeared. You don't understand business. I understand numbers. The Pierce Development Group is restructuring. I've read enough SEC filings to know restructuring can mean almost anything. His eyes narrowed. You've been looking into my company? No, I simply know how to read public records. His confidence cracked for the first time that evening. Only a little. Enough. I remembered hearing whispers months earlier. Construction delays, bridge loans, commercial vacancies, lawsuits. Charleston society loved pretending wealth lasted forever. Banks usually disagreed. Victoria interrupted before I could continue. Julian's temporary financial measures are irrelevant. They're the reason this document exists. No. They're exactly the reason. I looked back at the appraisal. If I surrender my half, Cynthia owns the estate outright. Neither spoke. Then the property becomes collateral. Still nothing. And eventually it gets sold. Julian rested both palms on the table. You make that sound dishonest. I make it sound accurate. His face hardened. You've always judged people with money. I almost laughed. If only you knew. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Victoria reached into another folder. This doesn't have to become unpleasant. She removed a second document. Not legal, personal. It contained printed photographs. Me entering Fort Meade. Me leaving an airport. Me walking into my apartment. Public places. Nothing classified. Still unsettling. I hired an investigator, she said calmly. I noticed. He believes you've become emotionally withdrawn. I stared at her. Emotionally withdrawn. Your behavior has changed. I grew up. You isolate yourself. My job requires discretion. She waved that away. People in your position receive psychological evaluations, don't they? There it was. The real threat. If you refuse to cooperate, she continued, perhaps your superiors should know you're becoming unstable. Julian nodded as though discussing the weather. It would only take one anonymous report. I looked at both of them. Neither seemed angry anymore. They seemed frightened, deeply frightened. Not of me, of money, or more accurately, the lack of it. I suddenly remembered something my father once told me while repairing a broken fence. Watch what people protect when they're desperate. That's usually where the truth lives. The truth sat right in front of me. Late loan payments, property appraisals, prepared transfer documents, private investigators, anonymous threats. None of this happens inside a healthy family with healthy finances. They weren't powerful. They were cornered. That realization changed everything. Because cornered people make reckless decisions. Victoria mistook my silence for hesitation. You don't need the property. I know. Cynthia does. No. I met her eyes. She wants it. The distinction mattered. Julian pushed a pen across the table. Sign. I left it exactly where it stopped. You know, I said. I've spent years making decisions where lives depended on staying calm. Neither reacted. They taught us something useful. Victoria crossed her arms. Oh? The loudest person in the room usually isn't the one in control. The conservatory became completely still. I folded the transfer papers, slid them neatly back into the folder, and placed it in front of my mother. Untouched, unsigned. I won't be giving away Dad's land. Victoria's face reddened. If you refuse, you're no longer welcome to use the Danforth name. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. The name came from my father. She opened her mouth. It doesn't belong to you. Her expression froze. And if you think anonymous accusations will frighten me, you should understand something. I stood. I've spent my entire career being judged by people who required evidence before they spoke. I pushed in the empty chair that I'd never been invited to sit in. So if you plan to tell lies, I'd suggest choosing a different audience. Without another word, I turned toward the ballroom. As I reached the conservatory doors, I caught my reflection in the glass. Same plain navy dress. Same tired eyes, same quiet posture. The difference wasn't visible, it was certainty. For the first time that night, I wasn't looking at a wealthy family protecting its legacy. I was looking at a bankrupt family trying to survive one more month by selling the last honest thing my father had ever left us. As I stepped back into the music and conversation, another thought crossed my mind. What happened in that conservatory was disturbing enough, but it reminded me of another family whose polished image collapsed under the weight of hidden debt. If that story catches your interest, watch for the recommendation that appears in the top right corner of your screen between minutes 45 and 55. The similarities are more unsettling than you might expect. I pushed open the ballroom doors just as the house lights dimmed another notch, and every conversation naturally drifted toward the stage. The engagement announcement was about to begin. A coordinator wearing a headset hurried across the room. Everyone to your assigned positions. Photographers adjusted their lenses. Servers made one final pass through the tables. The quartet quietly stepped aside as a grand piano recording faded into the room's sound system. I reached for another silver tray. This one carried 12 crystal champagne flutes instead of 36, but the tray itself was heavier. Solid silver. My father used to joke that it weighed as much as an anchor because nobody in Charleston trusted lightweight elegance. Before I took my second step, my mother's voice stopped me again. Not there. I turned. She pointed toward the far end of the ballroom. The back wall. I'm serving table 9. I changed my mind. There are already 2 servers assigned there. I know. She smiled for the photographers walking past us. I need you somewhere else. She led me several yards until we reached the service corridor hidden behind decorative columns. Most guests would never even notice this corner unless they were looking for the restrooms. She positioned me herself. No farther forward. I'm not blocking anyone. I didn't say you were. She stepped backward, studying the room as though arranging furniture. Then she frowned. Move 6 inches left. I did no. She shook her head. Your other left. I shifted again. There, satisfied, she folded her hands. Stay exactly here. I'm holding champagne. Good. So eventually I'll have to move. Not until I tell you. I glanced toward the photographers. They were lining up for the family portraits. Now I understood. You don't want me in the pictures. Her expression answered before her mouth did. Your dress is too plain. My dress is clean. You look tired. I am tired. You look depressing. That word lingered. Not cruel enough to shock anyone. Just polished enough to sound socially acceptable. She lowered her voice. Cynthia deserves beautiful memories. So does everyone. This night isn't about everyone. She straightened the sleeve of my dress without asking. It's about success. Then she walked away before I could answer. I stayed where she'd left me. Not because I accepted the insult. Because carrying a tray exactly where someone tells you to stand sometimes reveals more about them than walking away ever could. Guests continued taking their seats. Nearly 200 of them. Judges, hospital executives, real estate developers, university trustees, retired military officers, state legislators, people who spent entire careers building reputations. I wondered how many would recognize real character if it wasn't introduced with a microphone. A waiter beside me whispered, "Need a break? I'm fine. You've been carrying trays all evening. I've carried heavier." He laughed. I'll bet. If only he knew. A silver tray doesn't complain. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't leave families waiting for casualty notifications. Perspective changes weight. Across the ballroom, Cynthia floated from table to table like the evening had been designed around her. In fairness, it had. Every smile she gave looked practiced. Every laugh landed exactly where wealthy guests expected. Julian never wandered more than 3 feet away from the investors he hoped would rescue his company. He kept checking his watch. Interesting. People expecting good news rarely watch the clock. People waiting for a phone call from a lender usually do. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, the room settled. Thank you for joining us to celebrate 2 remarkable families. Polite applause. Victoria climbed the stage with effortless confidence. If anyone had entered the ballroom at that moment, they would have assumed she owned not only the event, but the entire city. She smiled toward the audience. My friends. Another pause. Tonight isn't simply about an engagement. She reached for Cynthia's hand. It's about legacy. The photographers fired another burst of flashes. I've often been asked who will carry the Danforth name into the future. She looked lovingly toward Cynthia. The answer has always been clear. More applause. My youngest daughter has dedicated herself to excellence, beauty, and community. Cynthia lowered her eyes modestly. She had rehearsed that reaction. Victoria continued. She represents everything our family has worked so hard to become. I noticed several guests nodding. People believe confidence surprisingly easily. Then my mother did something I hadn't expected. She looked directly toward me, not long, just enough. Her hand lifted. She pointed toward the back wall, and over there, several heads turned. Is our quiet little guest. A few people smiled politely. She spends her days shuffling government paperwork. A ripple of soft laughter moved across the ballroom. Victoria wasn't finished. We all make different choices in life. Another pause. And sometimes those choices become gentle reminders of what happens when we stop striving for excellence. More polite laughter. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to let everyone know they understood the joke. The joke was me. Nobody in the room knew they were laughing at someone whose work they weren't even cleared to hear about. One retired businessman actually raised his glass toward me with an amused grin. I almost admired the confidence. He had no idea. The tray remained perfectly level in my hands. I felt my heart beat once, then again, steady. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds held, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds held. Box breathing. The same exercise that had steadied my hands during classified operations worked just as well in tuxedo-filled ballrooms. Humiliation affects the body, training affects it more. My shoulders stayed square, my spine stayed straight. Not rigid, comfortable, deliberate. Years ago, an instructor had told us, the first thing pressure steals is posture. I had decided never to surrender mine. Across the room, Cynthia slowly lifted her champagne flute. She looked directly at me. Then she smiled, small, satisfied. Victorious. She tilted the glass in a silent toast, not out of love, out of triumph. As if she'd finally won a competition I hadn't realized we were playing. I looked back at her without blinking, not angry, not pleading, simply present. There is a strange moment when someone expects shame to appear on your face. When it doesn't, they become unexpectedly uncomfortable. I watched that discomfort flicker behind her smile, only for a heartbeat. Then it disappeared. The audience applauded again as Victoria announced the engagement. Crystal glasses rose throughout the ballroom. The photographers hurried closer to the stage. No one noticed the woman standing quietly beside the service corridor. Or perhaps they noticed exactly what they had been encouraged to see. A forgettable government employee. A disappointing daughter. A shadow carefully placed against the wall. The remarkable thing about shadows is that people stop looking at them. And that is exactly where the truth was about to walk into the room. I kept the tray balanced against my palm while the applause rolled across the ballroom like nothing unusual had happened. Victoria accepted another round of compliments. Cynthia admired her engagement ring every time someone asked to see it. Julian laughed a little too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny. The orchestra eased into another piece, and conversations resumed exactly where they'd left off. Charleston society had an impressive talent. It could turn almost any uncomfortable moment into background noise. A guest approached me with an empty flute. Another, please. I exchanged his glass without saying a word. He nodded politely before returning to a discussion about waterfront property taxes. Life kept moving, until it didn't. The sound reached the ballroom before anyone saw its source. A heavy door slammed open somewhere beyond the entrance hall, not carelessly. Forcefully, the orchestra faltered, one violin stopped altogether, several guests turned their heads. Then came another sound, measured, heavy, leather striking polished stone, not dress shoes, boots, combat boots. Each step echoed through the marble foyer with calm, deliberate authority. No hurry, no hesitation. People naturally stepped aside without knowing why. Security personnel near the entrance exchanged confused looks. One of them reached toward his radio. Another quietly lowered his hand again after recognizing the uniform approaching through the doorway. The ballroom fell strangely quiet. The massive entrance doors swung fully open. A man stepped inside wearing immaculate navy dress whites. Every ribbon sat perfectly aligned. His warfare insignia caught the chandelier light. Rows of decorations rested above his left pocket. Gold service stripes climbed one sleeve. His posture was so precise it looked almost mechanical, not stiff. Disciplined. He carried no arrogance, only purpose. Even before I recognized his face, I recognized the way he moved. Operators don't walk into rooms searching for attention. They walk into rooms already knowing exactly where they need to go. Master Chief Petty Officer Weston Cross. The last time I'd seen him in person had been inside a secure debriefing facility after that extraction. He'd looked exhausted then. Tonight he looked rested. Still dangerous. Still observant. The deployment briefing badge clipped inside his cover told me he'd come directly from Washington. He hadn't stopped to change. He hadn't stopped anywhere. He scanned the ballroom once. Just once. Not admiring the decorations. Assessing. Habit never really leaves people like us. The whispers began immediately. Is that? It can't be. I think that's the seal everyone was talking about. I heard he just came back from overseas. Someone near the front table quietly said, "That's Weston Cross." The name spread through the room faster than music ever could. Charleston loved successful people. Military heroes were especially popular when photographed from a comfortable distance. Victoria reacted almost instantly. Her smile became brighter than I'd seen all evening. She's climbed off the stage before the master of ceremonies even realized what was happening. "Excuse me." She glided toward the entrance with practiced elegance. Julian wasn't far behind. His expression transformed from nervous businessman to enthusiastic patriot in less than 3 seconds. Amazing what people can accomplish when they believe opportunity has walked through the door. Cynthia hurried after them, carefully adjusting her dress as she moved. The three of them reached Weston just inside the ballroom. Victoria extended both hands. "Master Chief Cross." Her voice carried farther than she intended. "What an extraordinary honor." Julian immediately joined in. "I'm Julian Pierce." He offered a confident handshake. "Our families have admired your service for years." Cynthia smiled brightly. "We're hosting tonight's charity gala." Victoria added, "Please allow us to welcome you personally." Weston never slowed, not even half a step. His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond them. Julian's hand stayed hanging awkwardly in the air. Victoria laughed lightly, assuming he simply hadn't noticed. "Master Chief?" "Nothing." Weston continued walking. He moved around Julian without touching him. Around Victoria without acknowledging her greeting. Around Cynthia as though she were part of the furniture. Not rude, simply focused. There is a difference. I had seen that expression before. On operations, people wore that face when every unnecessary distraction disappeared from existence. Only the objective remained. One guest whispered, "Did he just ignore them?" Another answered, "Maybe he didn't hear." He heard. Operators hear everything, especially in quiet rooms. Victoria tried again, quickening her pace to keep beside him. "We'd love to introduce you to our donors." Still nothing. Julian attempted to recover, perhaps after the toast. Weston walked straight past him. No eye contact, no handshake, no polite apology. The silence became heavier than any speech could have made it. Every guest watched. Nobody understood. Except me. I knew exactly what that walk meant. He wasn't lost. He wasn't looking for the stage. He wasn't interested in Charleston society. He had entered with a destination already fixed in his mind. His boots continued striking the marble floor steady. Even. Confident. Closer. Each step shortened the distance between us. The photographers, assuming something ceremonial was about to happen, raised their cameras. Flash units clicked into position. Several guests turned in their chairs to follow his path. Only then did they realize where he was going. Not toward the hosts, not toward the donors, not toward the engagement stage. Toward the darkest corner of the ballroom, toward the service corridor. Toward me, I remained exactly where I was. The tray stayed level. The crystal glasses reflected the chandeliers without trembling. Weston never looked left or right again. The room around him disappeared. Victoria finally stopped following. Confusion replaced confidence. Julian frowned. Cynthia's smile slowly faded. I watched all three of them trying to solve the same impossible question. Why would one of the most respected Navy SEALs in the country ignore every important person in the room? To walk directly toward the woman they'd spent the entire evening, pretending didn't matter. The answer was only a few steps away. I tightened my grip on the silver tray, just enough to keep the crystal glasses from shifting, as Weston Cross stopped less than 3 feet in front of me. The ballroom had become so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the refrigeration units behind the service doors. No orchestra, no conversations. Even the photographers hesitated, unsure whether they were witnessing an interruption or the beginning of something important. Weston didn't say a word. He looked directly at me. Not at my dress, not at the serving tray. At me. Years passed between us without either of us moving. The last time we'd stood face to face, neither of us had been wearing formal clothes. He had been covered in dust, dried blood, and concrete powder after the extraction. I'd been sitting behind classified monitors halfway across the world. We'd exchanged only a brief handshake during the secure debrief before both of us returned to work. People like us rarely celebrated. There was always another mission waiting. Now we stood inside a Charleston ballroom filled with people who believed appearances explained everything. Weston slowly brought his heels together. The sharp crack of polished military shoes striking marble echoed through the room. Every veteran present recognized the sound immediately, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. Then, in one flawless motion, his right hand snapped upward. A perfect military salute, not casual, not symbolic, precise enough to be taught in training manuals. The salute wasn't directed toward the stage, it wasn't for a politician. It wasn't for the wealthy donors filling the front tables. It was for the woman standing beside the service corridor carrying a champagne tray. A collective breath swept through the room. Someone whispered, "Who is he saluting?" Another answered, "The server?" Victoria stared without blinking. Julian looked from Weston to me and back again, as though his eyes refused to accept what they were seeing. Cynthia's champagne glass lowered halfway to her side. No one laughed anymore. I looked at Weston for one quiet second. Then I shifted the tray onto the nearby service cart. Only after my hands were free did I return his salute. Mine matched his exactly, every angle, every movement. Years of training leave little room for improvisation. Gasps spread across the ballroom. One retired Marine colonel near the front table stood halfway out of his chair before sitting down again. He knew enough to recognize a salute exchanged between professionals. Victoria finally found her voice. "What is this?" Nobody answered her. Weston remained at attention until I lowered my hand. Only then did he lower his. He took one slow breath. Then something happened that nobody in that ballroom expected, including several people who had worn uniforms themselves. Weston bent one knee, carefully, deliberately, until it rested against the polished marble floor, not because protocol demanded it. There is no military regulation requiring a Master Chief Petty Officer to kneel before an officer. He did it anyway. Not out of submission. Out of respect earned under circumstances no one else in that room had lived through. He looked up at me. When he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. Hades. The single word landed harder than any shout. People exchanged confused looks. Some assumed it was a nickname. Others realized immediately that it sounded like a military call sign. Weston continued. "Your orders, Commander." Another wave of silence crashed through the room. Commander. Not clerk, not assistant, not office worker, Commander. Then came the sentence that shattered everything my family had built all evening. "The Joint Chiefs are standing by." Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for another drink. A crystal flute slipped from someone's hand near the center table. It struck the marble floor. The sharp crack sounded impossibly loud. No one looked at it. Every eye remained fixed on us. Victoria laughed once, a nervous laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding." Weston didn't even glance toward her. "There is no misunderstanding." His eyes never left mine. Julian stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Master Chief, but I think you've mistaken my future sister-in-law for someone else." Weston's answers arrived without emotion. "I do not mistake state commanders who bring my people home." The room became even quieter, if that were possible. One of the retired officers slowly removed his glasses. "I know that voice," he murmured to the man beside him. Another guest frowned. "Commander?" Someone near the back whispered, "She serves in the military?" Victoria tried again. "This is my daughter, Roxanne. I know exactly who she is." Weston's words cut through every remaining doubt. "I've known exactly who she is since she refused to let 12 of us die." Several guests looked toward me with expressions that had completely changed. Not admiration, confusion. The kind of confusion people experience when the story they've believed suddenly stops making sense. I finally spoke. "Master Chief." "Ma'am, you weren't expected." "No, ma'am. Why are you here?" He allowed himself the smallest smile. "I received approval the moment your operation files were partially declassified." He reached inside his dress uniform. Several guests visibused before realizing he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He removed a sealed military envelope. "The Joint Chiefs asked that I personally deliver this." He held it in both hands. Still kneeling, waiting, I accepted the envelope. The seal remained unbroken. I already knew I wouldn't open it here. Not because I feared what was inside. Because some things still belonged outside public view. Weston rose smoothly back to his feet. Again, every movement carried the quiet precision of decades in uniform. He looked around the ballroom for the first time. His gaze moved across the chandeliers, across the donors, across Victoria, across Julian, across Cynthia. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. The disappointment of a man realizing that the person who had quietly carried extraordinary responsibility had been handed a serving tray instead of the respect she had long ago earned. He looked back at me. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? I knew exactly what he meant. Whatever came next would change every life in that ballroom. I gave one small nod, granted. Behind us, more than 200 people waited without making a sound. The truth had finally arrived, and for the first time that evening, it had someone willing to say it out loud. I lowered the sealed envelope to my side as Weston waited for my answer. Every pair of eyes in the ballroom remained fixed on us. The silence no longer belonged to my family. It belonged to the truth. I nodded once. Go ahead, Master Chief. Yes. Ma'am. Weston turned toward the stage with the same measured confidence he'd carried into the room. Nobody tried to stop him. Not the event coordinator. Not the hotel staff. Not even the private security guards stationed near the exits. Authority has a way of announcing itself without raising its voice. He walked to the presentation podium where Cynthia's engagement slideshow had been waiting to play. Vacation photos, engagement portraits, architectural renderings of a future Charleston mansion. Someone had spent weeks putting it together. Weston reached into the inside pocket of his dress whites and removed a government-issued secure mobile device. It looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested the amount of security hidden inside. He connected it to the ballroom projector with a small encrypted adapter. The giant screens flickered. Cynthia's smiling engagement portrait disappeared. For one brief second, the screen went black. Then a simple seal appeared. Department of Defense. Several guests instinctively leaned forward. A second line appeared beneath it. Off Orsor's public release, Weston entered a security code. The briefing opened. My photograph filled both projection screens, not the one from family albums. The official military portrait. Hair pulled back, dress uniform, no smile. Below it appeared the words that made the ballroom forget how to breathe. Commander Roxanne Elise Danforth. The room erupted. Not into applause, but into confused whispers. Commander? I thought her mother said she was a clerk. Did I read that correctly? One retired federal judge actually stood to get a better look. The next slide appeared. United States Navy Lieutenant Commander, 04, operational call sign. Hada's a note beneath it explained that the call sign had recently been cleared for limited public release following partial declassification of multiple joint operations. Several former military officers in the audience exchanged stunned glances. One quietly whispered, Hades? Another answered before anyone else could. I've heard that call sign. So have I. But nobody knew who it belonged to. Weston didn't interrupt the presentation. He let the document speak. The next page displayed the Silver Star citation. The ballroom projector enlarged every word. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, while directing joint special operations under hostile conditions, the citation continued, describing how unauthorized tactical decisions had preserved the lives of 12 special operations personnel during a classified extraction. No classified locations, no operational details, just enough to explain why the medal existed. I heard someone behind me quietly say, She's decorated. Another answered, Not just decorated, a silver star. The room suddenly understood that the woman carrying champagne all evening had earned one of the nation's highest awards for valor. Victoria looked from the screen to me, then back again. No, she barely whispered it. No, as if denial could rewrite government records. Julian took one uncertain step backward. This can't be right. Weston finally spoke. It is. His voice remained calm. I was one of the 12. Nobody questioned him, he continued. I am standing here because Commander Danforth refused to let procedure become more important than people. The words landed harder than any accusation. Recognition spread across the ballroom one face at a time. Not admiration, correction. People were quietly rearranging everything they believed about me. Weston advanced to the next document. This is the portion Commander Danforth never wanted anyone outside the government to see. I felt my stomach tighten. He looked at me first, with permission previously granted. I gave a small nod. He pressed the remote. Another document appeared. This one wasn't military. It carried the letterhead of the Danforth Family Trust. Victoria's eyes widened immediately. "How did you get that?" Weston answered without looking at her. The commander authorized a financial disclosure after partial declassification. Rows of numbers filled the screens. Dates. Monthly deposits, account transfers, legal entities, every payment entered with precise documentation. At the top of the page, one highlighted figure drew everyone's attention. Total private contributions over 8 years, 247,318.64. Below that came the source. Combat Hazard Pay Special Operations, Retention Incentives Classified Assignment Compensation. Gasps rolled through the ballroom. A financial advisor sitting near the front quietly adjusted his glasses. He scanned the figures twice before speaking. "My God," another guest frowned. The trust wasn't funded by the estate, it was funded by her. Every monthly transfer appeared: property taxes, insurance premiums, historic preservation fees, roof repairs, grounds maintenance, King Street commercial lease payments, luxury vehicle insurance, boutique renovation invoices. Every elegant piece of Cynthia's carefully constructed success traced back to one source: me. The projector didn't accuse anyone. It simply documented reality. Numbers don't need dramatic speeches. They tell their own story. Victoria reached for the podium. "Turn this off." Nobody moved. I said, "Turn it off." Weston remained completely still. "The documents are accurate. They're private. They were." Her face lost every trace of color. Not pale. Gray. Like cold ash after a fire burns itself out. She slowly looked around the ballroom. Nobody met her eyes. The same people who had praised her less than 20 minutes earlier now stared at the financial records instead. Charleston society valued many things: money, reputation, influence, but it respected one thing even more: proof. Julian picked up a champagne flute from the nearest table. His hand shook, just enough. The crystal slipped through his fingers. It shattered across the marble floor. Nobody looked down. Nobody cared about broken glass anymore. The truly fragile thing in the room had never been crystal. It had been the story my family spent years telling. Cynthia stood perfectly still. I didn't know. I believed her. Not because she was innocent, because she'd never bothered asking where comfort came from. People rarely investigate gifts they enjoy receiving. Weston stepped away from the projector and returned to stand beside me. No spotlight followed him. None was necessary. The entire ballroom had already shifted. Not physically, morally. A retired Navy captain slowly walked across the room. He stopped in front of me. He didn't salute. He simply extended his hand. "Commander." I shook it. "Thank you for your service." Another guest approached. Then another. Not because I had become someone new, because they had finally been introduced to the person who had been standing in front of them all evening. The applause that eventually filled the ballroom wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't for exposing my family. It wasn't even really for me. It sounded different, quieter, more thoughtful, almost uncomfortable. 'Cause this wasn't a celebration. It was a room full of people recognizing how easily they had mistaken humility for insignificance. How quickly they had accepted a convenient lie because it fit the picture they wanted to believe. I looked once toward the back wall where my mother had ordered me to stand. The shadow was still there. Only now everyone understood that the shadow had never diminished the person standing inside it. It had simply made the truth harder to see. And once that truth finally stepped into the light, there was no corner left in the ballroom where a lie could survive. I watched the last guest leave the ballroom before I finally opened the envelope Weston had handed me. Inside was a single sheet of official Department of Defense letterhead. Nothing dramatic. No congratulatory speech. No ceremonial language. Just formal confirmation that portions of several operations had been cleared for limited public disclosure, and that I was authorized to acknowledge my military service if I chose to do so. I folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. For years, silence had been part of my job. Now it had become a choice instead of an obligation. There was a difference. Weston walked over carrying 2 cups of black coffee he'd somehow convinced the kitchen staff to make. He handed one to me. "You all right, ma'am?" "I will be." He smiled. "I figured you'd say that." We stood quietly for a moment. No cameras, no speeches, no reporters waiting outside. That was another thing movies usually get wrong. Real endings rarely happen under bright lights. They happen in quiet conversations after everyone else has gone home. "I owe you an apology," Weston said. I looked at him. "For what? I should have come sooner. You didn't know." "I suspected." He looked toward the empty ballroom. I just never imagined they treated you like this. They've been treating me like this for years." He shook his head. 12 operators would have walked into certain death without you. I didn't save them alone. You know what I mean. I did. But I also knew something else. No military mission is ever won by one person. Someone gathers intelligence, someone flies, someone repairs equipment, someone keeps fuel moving, someone stands watch while everyone else sleeps. Leadership isn't about standing above people. It's about carrying responsibility when nobody notices you're carrying it. Weston understood that, which was why he never exaggerated what I'd done. He simply refused to let it stay hidden. The ballroom doors opened again, not dramatically this time. Just quietly, Victoria walked inside alone. For the first time all evening, she looked her age. The confidence she'd worn like jewelry was gone. She stopped several feet away. "I need to speak with you. I know." Her eyes dropped briefly to the coffee in my hand, then back to my face. "I didn't know. No, I truly didn't. I know." She seemed surprised that I believed her. "I thought," she stopped herself. "I thought your job was a desk job?" She nodded once. "I let you believe that. Why? Because that's what national security required." Silence settled between us. Finally, she asked the only question that still mattered. "The trust. What about it? Will the payments continue?" There it was. Not an apology, not regret, not concern, the trust, the money. For years I would have answered carefully, tried to soften the conversation, protected everyone from consequences. Tonight felt different. "No." She blinked. "No?" I signed the termination paperwork before coming back into the ballroom. Her shoulders stiffened. "You all ready?" "Yes." Earlier that evening, while Weston spoke privately with military representatives, I'd called the attorney managing the anonymous legal entity. The conversation lasted exactly 9 minutes. He already knew why I was calling. "I've prepared everything," he'd said. "You've been expecting this?" "I've been hoping for it." He emailed the documents through a secure portal. I reviewed every page, effective immediately. No more monthly transfers, no more anonymous funding, no more emergency deposits, no more quiet rescues from financial decisions that weren't mine. I signed electronically at 9:18 p.m. 8 years ended with one signature. The attorney called back 12 minutes later. "The trust will remain active only long enough to satisfy outstanding legal obligations. And after that, it will be exhausted." "What about the Charleston property?" "The estate no longer has sufficient liquidity." I already knew what came next. "The bank will begin foreclosure proceedings unless another funding source appears." "There won't be one." "I understand." Now my mother stood in front of me, hearing the consequences for the first time. "The house. I know. It belonged to your father. It still does." She frowned. "I don't understand. I protected it as long as I could." I held her gaze. "I won't protect choices he never made." She lowered her eyes. For the first time in my life, I realized something important. I wasn't looking at a powerful woman. I was looking at someone who had confused dependence with entitlement for so long that she no longer recognized the difference. A few moments later, Cynthia walked in. Her makeup had started to smear beneath her eyes. She wasn't crying dramatically. She simply looked tired. "I'm sorry." I believe that too, not because it fixed anything. Because sometimes people don't understand the cost of comfort until the bill finally arrives. I should have asked where everything came from. Yes. I never did. "No." She nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know. Julian never came back." According to one of the event staff, he'd left through a side exit after receiving another phone call from his company's attorneys. That seemed appropriate. Some people spend their lives running toward appearances. Others spend them running away from consequences. I reached into my purse and removed my phone. 3 contacts: Victoria, Cynthia, Julian. I blocked each number, not angrily, not just quietly. The screen asked for confirmation each time. I pressed confirm 3 times. Some people think blocking someone is punishment. Sometimes it's simply the healthiest boundary you'll ever build. Weston picked up my overnight bag. "I'll walk you out. You don't have to." "I know." We stepped through the front entrance together. The humid Charleston air felt cooler than it had earlier that evening. The noise of the ballroom disappeared as the heavy doors closed behind us. I stopped on the wide concrete steps overlooking the nearly empty street. For the first time all day, there was nothing in my hands. No tray, no classified tablet, no legal documents. Just my father's brass compass. I opened it. The scratched words inside the lid caught the light from the theater entrance. Stand steady until truth arrives. I smiled. You were right, Dad. The compass clicked shut. Weston quietly returned my bag. Where to now, Commander? I looked toward the street. Home. He smiled. Virginia, eventually. What first? I took one slow, unhurried breath. The kind that reaches all the way to the bottom of your lungs. First, somewhere nobody expects anything from me. He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Because it did. I watched the lights reflecting across the pavement and realized freedom doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives the moment you stop carrying burdens that never belonged to you. I walked down the theater steps alone. Not abandoned, not defeated. Simply finished with a chapter that had lasted far too long. The family name had never defined my character. Their approval had never measured my worth, and silence had never meant weakness. If this story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this. Never mistake quiet strength for a lack of courage. The people doing the hardest work often have the least interest in talking about it. Respect should never depend on titles, wealth, or appearances, because dignity exists long before anyone notices it. Boundaries are not acts of revenge, they're acts of self-respect. And sometimes the bravest decision you'll ever make isn't saving someone else. It's finally giving yourself permission to stop rescuing people who refuse to change. Before you leave, take a look at the video waiting on your screen. It's one of the stories viewers return to more than almost any other on this channel. And if this journey stayed with you, there's a good chance that one will too.